panel is The China-Russia Threat, moderated by Charles Davidson, publisher of The American Interest, our partner here in this endeavor. He is joined by Vladimir Kara-Murza, Vice President of Free Russia Foundation, Moises Naim, Distinguished Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, Laura Rosenberger, Senior Fellow and Director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and Lilia Shevtsova, Associate Fellow at the Russia-Eurasia Program at Chatham House. If I could ask you to take your seats, please, we're going to get started. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be here. And thank you, David, and thank you, FIU. Every year we continue to be more impressed with FIU, and we advertise FIU in Washington, D.C., and point out that it's the fourth largest university in the country, which people are increasingly learning. I should just point out one technical matter, which is that there's an omission in the book on David Kramer's bio, which is that it doesn't mention that he's a contributing editor to The American Interest. And in fact, if you go to our website and you type in Kramer in the search function, you'll see a lot of things penned by David Kramer. And so he's been a very important part of the magazine for many years. And he's written quite a bit on the subject of our panel today, in fact, including quite recently. So what we're going to do with this absolutely extraordinary group is let each of them make a statement to explain their view on this extremely serious subject that we're discussing. So they'll each speak for 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll resolve any differences or inconsistencies in terms of what has been said. And then we will leave a lot of time to entertain students' questions. And since we'll have a bit more time than some of the other sessions for that, we may take a question and play with it a little bit before we go on to the next one. We'll have it be a little less linear. So here we go. We're going to start off with Vladimir Kara-Murza. Then we're going to move to Lilia Shevtsova.
Oh, you are missing everybody else.
Sorry? Yes, well, we're framed by the Russians this afternoon.
Russia is surrounding, yes?
Yes, Russia's surrounding. And then we'll go to Laura Rosenberger, and Moises Naim will then conclude these opening statements. So I very much look forward to what they have to say, and I hope you find this interesting. Thank you. Vladimir.
Thank you, Charles. And I'd like to point out that you're breaking the rules that we've been set because David repeated it 4 or 5 times to all of the participants, no opening statements. So, David, we're breaching those rules, and we're all going to make them. But I want to start by thanking David Kramer for bringing all of us here for the 3rd time in a row now. And it's, Charles, you're absolutely right. It grows in stature and interest and level of discussion, I think, every year. And thank you to FIU Green School and the McCain Institute and the American Interest for co-hosting and organizing this great conference. Our subject, the subject of our panel is the China-Russia threat, as you can see up there on the wall. But I want to kind of define the linguistic terms straight away at the very beginning of our discussion, because the threat is not Russia. The threat is the kleptocratic and authoritarian regime of Vladimir Putin. Last week, we marked the sad 20th anniversary of the coming of this regime. It's now entered its 3rd decade. And we've now had a whole generation of people in our country who have grown up not knowing any other political reality, not having any other political memories. And when we talk about the foreign policy aspects of what the Putin regime represents, as we are during this panel, I think it's very important to always remember the inextricable link between the domestic and the international when we're talking about Russian politics. I was at a discussion recently in one of the Western European capitals that was dedicated to Russian foreign policy, and every time any speaker would kind of slip into speaking about the domestic situation, the moderator would kind of break them off and say, no, we're not talking about domestic politics. This is a foreign policy discussion. And I kind of saw the bewilderment on many people's faces at that moment, because when we're talking about Russia, it is impossible to separate the domestic from the international. And that is absolutely true generally. I think if we look at our history, especially our modern history, we will see that whatever's happening in Russia domestically has a direct bearing on the international posturing. When Russia's more democratic and more liberal at home, the foreign policy looks very different from when we have an authoritarian regime as we do today. On one of the previous panels, my very good friend Žygis Paviljonis spoke several times. He referred to the crackdown, the Soviet crackdown in Vilnius in January of 1991, when Gorbachev and the Politburo sent tanks to crush the Lithuanian independence movement. And I remember very well, I was a child, but when something like this is happening before your eyes, you notice it and you remember it for the rest of your life. The sight of 500,000 people on Manezhne Square under the Kremlin walls in downtown Moscow, 500,000 Russian people standing with the banners hands off Lithuania. And every time I'm in Vilnius, I always try to, if he's feeling well, to go and see Professor Vytautas Landsbergis, somebody I have enormous respect for, the father of modern Lithuania, the father of the Lithuanian independence movement. And I just love sitting and talking with him. I'm a historian by education, so kind of recalling to those times in the late 80s and early 90s when the Russian leadership and the Russian president, Boris Yeltsin at the time, made an enormous contribution to helping secure the freedom and independence of the Baltic states. Something that would sound almost crazy to a modern-day observer. How can the president of Russia help secure independence for Soviet captive nations? But that is exactly what happens when Russia itself, when Russia at home, is very different from what we're seeing today. So when we talk about Putin's foreign policy and the threat he and his policies represent to the democratic world, it's very important to always remember that we're not talking about Russia and Russian interests and a threat coming from Russia. There is nothing about Russian national interests in what Putin's been doing, for example, when he's propping up fellow dictatorships all over the world, using Russian taxpayer money, I may add, everywhere from Venezuela to Sudan. Not very successfully in the latter case, hopefully in the long term not successfully in the former case either. There's nothing about Russian national interests when Putin sends one of his closest cronies, a former convicted criminal by the name of Yevgeny Prigozhin, to run his proxy mercenary wars to the furthest corners of the globe, from Latin America to Asia to Africa. This is the same guy who's behind the Wagner Group, the Kremlin shadowy semi-military organization that is involved in Venezuela, that is involved in several countries in Africa, that is most likely behind the murder of 3 Russian investigative journalists in Central Africa 18 months ago, that was involved in Libya and Sudan and all of these places. The aggression, the posturing, everything that Vladimir Putin has been doing in terms of his standing in the international arena is mostly 99%, I would say, domestically oriented. For propaganda purposes, and there's nothing like pretending to be great, pretending to have great power status, and nothing like trying to create an external enemy for domestic propaganda purposes when you're an authoritarian regime, and that's exactly what he's been doing, whether we're talking about Ukraine or other parts of the world, and certainly the United States is kind of the shadow big enemy moving behind all of it. And everything that Putin's regime has been doing internationally has at its roots and at its origins the overarching objective of trying to cling on to power at home because they know that they'll have to face up and be held responsible for all things while they're out. And so I think that's one overarching issue that we should always remember when we talk about the foreign policy aspects of the Putin regime, is that everything at the end of the day is domestic. Last year we marked the 30th anniversary of the famous Mind speech by US President George H.W. Bush that he gave in May of 1989 in West Germany, when he spoke about his vision of a Europe whole and free. Last year I had the honor of participating in a project led by the Polish Institute of International Affairs. It was kind of dedicated to the 30th anniversary of the Bush Mind speech, and it was a volume of essays and a collection of articles by scholars and activists and political leaders from different countries to kind of assess where we are 30 years after the Mainz speech. And kind of the main premise of my piece in that collection was that the progress towards achieving that goal was enormous, I think unimaginable for that generation of later Cold War political leaders in the Western world. But more than 30 years on, we're still not there, because Europe cannot be whole and free until the largest country in Europe, which is Russia, continues to be ruled by a kleptocratic and authoritarian regime. And I want to refer once again to what my friend Gigis Pavilionis said in the previous panel, that when we talk about policy and when we talk about strategy, the long-term goal of everything that we will, and I'm going to be talking about in this panel and others, we have to keep in mind that at the end of the day, if that goal of Europe whole, free, and at peace still remains, that will only be possible once Russia is fully a part of it.
Thank you, Vladimir. Lilia, do you have anything to say about this?
If you allow me, well, I'm very grateful to Volodya that you said all very important things about Russia, which allows me to play on a bit different field. But firstly, Charles, I would like to mention that there is another threat or challenge, and I'm talking about this event. That definitely is a challenge, that definitely is a threat, the threat for the tradition of boring, dull, absolutely stupid gatherings with chattering heads. I hope that I'm not chattering head. That usually dominate this scene in all major universities, think tanks. Look at Washington, Paris, London, Moscow, of course. Thanks to David, we are all friends of David. But this event is exciting not only because it has been provoking, challenging. It's a wonderful event. It's a wonderful event not only because of David, but because we saw these young faces with mics, and we really appreciate. You gave us some new energy, folks. So it's really privilege and fun to be here. And now, if I may, very briefly, you are looking at me with, yes, I know, I have to be disciplined. 2 points, if I may. One point is about the title of our panel, Russia and China, or China and Russia. And usually this is the tradition. I've read so many interesting and boring, exciting and not essays, Russia and China, et cetera, as if these states are Siamese twins, as if we are talking about some monster with 2 heads. And really, realpolitik that still exists, as we've seen today and yesterday, brings these 2 countries together on many issues. But at the same time, there are so many areas, problems, interests that make them totally different, hostile to each other. And these countries already have incompatibilities in Central Asia, in Arctic, in Africa, come on. And if we are thinking about the trivia and about historical patterns, there is one pattern that has been, demonstrating itself through the centuries, formulated by Greeks. The country and state that is rising and the country that is in decay, they inevitably are coming to conflict. And only 2 numbers, perhaps. One of the biggest Chinese provinces, Guangdong, has population 110 million people and GDP $1.2 trillion. Russia's GDP is $1.1 trillion, and our population is 140 million. There are 25 million Russians living in the Far East, confronting and bordering with the northern Chinese province of 110 million people. So there is dominating view in Moscow, behind the scene, not openly, of course, that we are different, and we are doomed to have conflict. And this conflict could influence not only regional and geopolitical stability, it can create absolutely new existential challenges for the West too. And the question is how the West will react to our inevitable incompatibility. Does it create possibilities for the liberal civilization or threats? let's look at this China-Russia marriage of convenience in this way. And one more point about Russia's paradox and sources of Russia's strength. We've been hearing here different things about Russia's predatory power. Russia has a strategy in the Middle East. Russia is undermining everything, yes. Russia is hostile to the West, yes, of course. Russia is breaking the windows, of course, indeed, and will be. But at the same time, I've been reading recently, 2 days ago, perhaps, in New York Times, the article of absolutely fantastic American journalist that has been proven that Russia has undermined successfully the American world and undermined the American position nearly everywhere, becoming the most powerful force. And I was thinking, what country he's talking about? Because what we see in Ukraine, in Syria, in Mozambique, even in Venezuela, in Africa, definitely, we see tactical gains zigzagging that could easily become strategic disasters. And then we have to rack our heads. What are the real sources of Russia's influence, quote unquote, of Russia's predatory behavior? What are these sources? And I'm looking at Charles. Not you are the force, but well, before I'm coming to your thesis, firstly, of course, Russia's ability to break the windows and to blackmail, but not that important. It's the readiness and ability and, well, perhaps readiness of the West to be blackmailed. Secondly, naivete of the Western community, Western political class, and Western expert gangs. Special interests, look at Macron. He wants to be the European leader, playing tango and dancing tango with Putin. And thirdly, of course, this is kleptocracy. Nino, you've been mentioning it already. It's your project, Kleptocracy Initiative. It's the emergence of the powerful political and business community in the Western countries that is interested in Russia's dirty money, in Azeri dirty money, in Kazakh dirty money, in Chinese dirty money. But without Mr. Schroeder, without former Presidents Chirac, Sarkozy, former Prime Minister Tony Blair, hardly Russia would be that powerful predatory power dancing freely on the political scene. So only Western weaknesses make Russia really strong, effective, and pretending to have a strategy that it never had. Because Russia's strategy in the Middle East and everywhere is, what are we going to do in the evening? 3 minutes.
Beautiful, Lilia. Thank you. Laura?
Well, thank you, and thanks again to David and to FIU, and it's great to follow Vladimir and Lilia with their great opening comments. And I'm going to pivot off of some things that they both just laid out. I think it's really important that Lilia started to pick up on this difference between the China threat and the Russia threat. And I think certainly in U.S. national security strategy and the NDS and a bunch of other U.S. national security documents, the China-Russia great power competition frame has become how we see these two challenges that we face. And there's no question that there are similarities between those two challenges. Both of these regimes in Moscow and Beijing are trying to undermine and at least reshape, in the case of China, the liberal international order. Both of these regimes are shaped externally by insecurities at home, the domestic drivers that Vladimir talked about in terms of Putin's foreign policy certainly also motivates a lot of what we see from Xi Jinping and the Chinese party state. Both of these regimes are using new ways of exercising power on a shifting battlefield, using a suite of asymmetric tools, often non-military tools, on top of conventional tools that they use as means of exercising power. Yeah. And both of these regimes are using a US retreat and the creation of vacuums as opportunities in order to exercise and gain power externally. But I would say, in brief, that is where a lot of the similarities end. And in fact, as Lilia rightly noted, Russia is an objectively declining power, certainly under this regime. China and the Chinese party state is an objectively rising power. That gives them very different kinds of interests, it gives them very different time horizons, gives them very different kinds of risk tolerance, and it gives them very different kinds of leverage. And I would argue that in every case, China has more leverage, China has a different set of interests, it is less risk tolerant, it is actually trying in many ways to reshape and create, whereas the Russian regime under Putin is trying to undermine and weaken others. And I see those as actually very different kinds of strategies, while the tactics may on their surface appear to be similar. And so I think to the degree that policymakers actually conflate these two threats, we confuse the solutions in very unhelpful ways. I think that we sometimes end up focusing on the wrong tactics and overreading into certain threats while missing the larger and longer term threats. Particularly in the US, in Washington, we tend to not be very good at the long-term strategy. And that is certainly an area where the Chinese party state is extraordinarily effective. And we are seeing China compete with the United States in basically every space in which there can be such competition. Now, that doesn't mean that the US should see all of that competition as either necessarily zero-sum or as of equal threat. What we need to be doing is a much better sense of prioritizing and analyzing both where we have our own advantages and how we can actually regain the upper hand, and where the greatest threats are to our interests. The one point I would just wrap up on is that I might take a slightly different view on the relationship between Beijing and Moscow. Because I do think that while in the past it had been a marriage of convenience on certain issues, and there's no question that they still have lots of areas of friction, and you named Central Asia and you named the Arctic, and we could keep on going down the list. But at least in this moment in time, and it may be a sort of, an axis where as one power is going one direction and the other is going direction for a certain Venn diagram overlapping period of time, they have a greater overlapping set of interests. But I would argue that particularly in the space of technology, and particularly in the space of internet governance, in cyberspace, in data governance, where we are seeing significant new exercises of power and new spaces of competition, we are seeing significant cooperation between Beijing and Moscow, and frankly in areas where the United States and our democratic allies aren't really understanding the game that's being played. And I think that if we're actually going to begin to meet the threats that we see from both of these regimes, we need to much better understand the spaces where power is being exercised in new and different ways, the way that they are cooperating in these areas where we're not paying attention, and work with our democratic allies around the world, both in Asia and in Europe, in order to step up our game in those spaces.
I agree.
Great, thank you, Laura. Moises?
So you want me to summarize what everyone has said?
Well, you have no, you have your own take on this, Moises.
No, first I want to declare myself a proud member of the Friends of David's club. That means, as in another panel was said, when he calls, we show up. But congratulations, and by now I feel like a veteran of this meeting that, like others have said, is getting better and better. So congratulations and thank you. In my 4 minutes or 3.5 minutes left, I am going to talk about what I call the China surprise and Russia's paradox. And they have to do both things with what does it take in the 21st century to be a superpower. Superpowers are nations that have the ability to project power and influence across continents, across long distances, are capable of operating militarily and in other ways. Across oceans, continents. It used to be very expensive. To be a superpower, you required weaponry, you required bases, you required personnel. It was very, very expensive. The costs of being a superpower in the 21st century have dwindled. And that is one of the Russia's paradoxes. This is a country that is shrinking in its economy and its population. Its economy is a petrostate, essentially, that its main source of revenues is the exports of oil and gas. And its economy is smaller than that of Brazil or Canada. Depending on the price of oil, sometimes is even smaller. Its economy is even smaller than Spain. So this is a country that does not have the economic resources to be a superpower, but it is. And it's getting to be a superpower by using techniques and strategies and tactics and technologies that belong to the 21st century, that were not available prior to that. And you know exactly what I mean, is the technologies and the capabilities that allow Russia to have a saying in what's happening in Catalonia, where in the biggest, in the turmoil there, Russian bots played an important role. Or in Brexit, or the well-known intervention in America's election, as documented by the intelligence communities of the United States. So, not only that, but Russia is also a country that's becoming depopulated. Russia's population has been declining since the 1990s. By 2050, it's going to lose 20 million people more. So how can a country with a small economy and a small and declining population can boast of a growing international influence? Well, that's an important question, and I think probing into that question tells us it's very interesting in terms that it shows what does it take to be a superpower in the 21st century. And I don't have the time to elaborate, but perhaps we can do it in the question and answer. The other is China's surprise. China is a superpower, and yet China is a very poor country. China's economy will overtake that of the United States, depending on how you count it. Some analysts already say that China has a larger economy than that of the United States, and if it doesn't have it now, will have it in coming years. But that doesn't mean that China is a rich country. China is, in per capita, if you divide the GDP by the number of people, it ends up that China is a very poor country. Poor countries are not supposed to be superpowers. You as a poor country could not afford to be a superpower. And yet, the China surprise, is that China is a superpower. And it combines old ways of being a superpower, which is mighty, huge armies, huge weaponries, now building, increasingly getting to be a blue sea kind of navy, a navy able to, at stake is the control of the most important sea lanes in the world, in the south, in surrounding seas and so on. So it's using all the traditional means and tools and technologies and strategies of being a superpower combined, they too, with the new technological, information-based technologies. And it is that novelty of a poor country becoming a superpower, and of a country that is shrinking economically and in terms of population, that also can become a superpower. So those are the kinds of challenges for which we don't have good answers, for which we don't have a ways of thinking that match the velocity with which these things are changing. And again, the central message is that we need to take a look at what does it take to be a superpower in the 21st century, and how does one manage that in geopolitical and other terms.
Thank you. We'll get to Lilia in a second. She has something to say.
Can I have only 1 minute?
Yeah.
Because Moises provoked me, could I give you a variation of your melody? I agree on Russia's paradox. I would call it existential conundrum. Just, I'm thinking aloud. Russia currently can exist only as a superpower. We call it great power. It has never been a normal power. And great power status is Russia's bone structure. But the problem is that drama and tragedy is that without transformation and change, it can aspire to be only military superpower with this kind of economy, okay? Only military resources. But military resources, as you say, have been and are and will be exhausted. And in this case, we can think about transformation, but transformation of Russia's superpower will mean what? Collapse of the state. And even Russian liberals cannot allow to think about it, okay? So this is Russia's drama. Either Russia has to exist this way or agree to the idea that it will mean collapse of Russia's state in the current geographical format. Will Europe and the West be ready for that?
Briefly, those are excellent points, and in fact, I agree both with the points and the question.
You provoked. I'm not sure
And
that I'm right.
I'm glad I did. But let me just now respond, because you provoked me now.
And I'm caught in the crossfire.
I'm your Salieri, you're Mozart.
We'll see, this is just as
very
controversial as
briefly,
immigration.
first I want to talk about oil and then about Obama. A lot of what you said and about the future depends on your assumption about oil and its role in the economy. If hydrocarbons and the whole carbon economy gets more constrained, and you end up with a lot of oil that you cannot use. And Russia without oil will be a completely different story. And therefore, it's not what the Russians will decide, is what the world will decide about oil that will determine Russia's options. Because it may be that Russia is considering options that it will not be able to afford because the revenues will have, you know, if in 30, 40 years the consumption of oil is much lower and the demand for whatever, for the only thing that Russia is competitive in exporting, will then limit greatly what Russian strategists and elites can decide. That's one. And the second, about the notion of Russia as a superpower, there was a thing that I think Barack Obama is regretting to today. I think in an open mic or at some point, he just dismissed Russia and said in a very dismissive way, you know, Russia is just a regional power. And Putin cannot survive that, and is trying to do all he can and has been very successful in showing that no, Russia is not a regional power. Russia now can operate and influence events way beyond its immediate neighborhood and the near abroad of what used to be the Soviet Union. So it is this desperation to continue to be a global superpower that is driving a lot of the kinds of foreign policy issues that the three of you have highlighted correctly, which are driving the conversation and the decision-making and strategies, both in Russia and in Beijing.
Well, thank you. And David Kramer, yeah, I apologize for the opening statements. I hope that was okay. And we'll continue with this discussion a bit. I see that we have a time clock too, so we'll try to be very disciplined with that. And in a few minutes, also, we'll move to questions from the audience, which we'll also use as prompts. And it's a great pleasure to be here with FIU students again. And so if we see any lines accumulating behind the mics, then we'll start to temper our discussion and come to you. One thing that strikes me, though, in this discussion, which we could perhaps touch on, is obviously China is a growing power, which has been on this big economic upswing and was a weak country if we go back a number of years, whereas Russia was the Soviet Union, so with nuclear weapons and a huge amount of hard power. So we have that legacy. If we were to take some other country, or Spain or Italy, or a country with a similar GDP to Russia, and apply all of these technological nouveautés, because they wanted to become a superpower, it would be a different scenario. So how do we think about this Soviet legacy in terms of the Russia threat today? Any of you who would like to take a stab at that? Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, please. That's too nice.
The superpowerdom is going to become very crowded. places like Iran using, what are some of the main apprehensions about the ability of Iran to retaliate for Soleimani's assassination? Well, it's a cyber attack, and I think Anne-Marie Slaughter mentioned it. But there are others. There are other tools that drive power that can be used by countries that you would not include in countries that are significant international players. Turkey. Turkey is now sending troops to Libya. Turkey is playing a very important role in Venezuela. Why? You know, that's very surprising. These are countries that did not have much in common or too many links in the past. Now there are very strong links. So what we're seeing is that there are the barriers to entry to superpowerdom have lowered, and new entrants can have a role that in the past would not have been possible.
Vladimir?
Charles, thank you for the question, because I think even those words you mentioned, Soviet legacy, that's something that's been central to Putin's rule, both domestically and internationally, for the 2 decades he's been in power. I remember very well, when you recall to 20 years ago, there were all these questions around Western capitals, who is Mr. Putin? What's he about? Which direction he's going to take Russia? There was this famous question asked at the World Economic Forum in Davos by, I think, Trudy Rubin of the Philadelphia Inquirer. Just, who's Mr. Putin? And then all the Russian panelists went quiet, and then the whole burst out laughing. This was, I think, in January of 2000. But I actually remember the precise day, may sound strange, but you'll understand why, the precise day when, to me at least, and to I know many of my friends and colleagues, it became absolutely clear just who this man was and what he was about. And that day was the 20th of December, 1999. So 11 days before Mr. Putin actually became acting president. He was still Prime Minister of Russia. That is a day that is still marked officially as the day of the Chekar, to commemorate the founding of the Bolshevik secret police in December of 1917. And on that day, Vladimir Putin, who was prime minister, went to Lubyanka Square, to the KGB headquarters, or the FSB headquarters, to officially unveil a memorial plaque to Yuri Andropov. Now, Yuri Andropov, somebody who's been central to Soviet policies of repression for many, many years. As ambassador to Budapest, he had coordinated the invasion in 1956, and as longtime chairman of the KGB, he instituted a special directorate that was tasked with suppressing and targeting political dissent, the so-called Fifth Special Directorate of the KGB. He also expanded the horrific practice of punitive psychiatry when political dissidents were being confined to psychiatric institutions and kept there in torturous conditions for many years. Now, when you have the Prime Minister of Russia go and officially unveil a memorial plaque to that guy, I think the question of who is Mr. Putin is answered very, very clearly. And in fact, we saw that one of the first actions of Putin when he became president was to restore the Soviet-era national anthem as the national anthem of the Russian Federation. Russia is a country of symbols. And so by things like this, you can very clearly pinpoint to what's going to happen. And sure enough, the symbols were very soon followed by substance. Again, both domestically, we have so many things that characterize the Soviet era that we have now again, political prisoners, the lack of free and fair elections, media censorship, and all the rest of it. And of course, everything that we're talking about today, internationally, the posturing, the aggression, the attempts to spread influence to the furthest corners of the globe. That's something reminiscent of the Soviet era too. But I think there was a very important point that was made by Lilia Shevtsova when she said that there's this kind of conundrum, right, between maintaining the superpower status, whatever it means today, or losing the state. And I think it's a very serious problem and a very serious question. And it's for us, for Russian Democrats, Russian liberals, those who want to see a different Russia based on different values, to find a third way between those two. Because there must be one. I mean, I remember Vladimir Bukovsky, who was one of the most prominent faces of the Soviet dissident movement. He once said that our overarching aim was to make sure that the regime falls, but the country survives. And I think those words are once again very topical. We don't want our state to fail. We don't want our state to cease to exist. That is not what we want. We want our country to be a normal country that would have a democratically elected government that would respect the rights and freedoms of our own people and would behave in a responsible manner on the international stage. And again, those two things are directly connected.
Laura?
Yeah, I just want to go back to, I totally agree with what Vladimir just laid out. I think that's a really important point. But I also think, just to go back to a little bit of the premise of your question, and the idea that sort of Russia's hard power status, its status as a nuclear power, its status of having a significant army isn't something that we need to worry about anymore. And I just want to make sure to emphasize that that's not in fact the case, right? I mean, Russia is still a very significant nuclear power. In fact, its violation of the INF Treaty and the subsequent U.S. withdrawal from that treaty, we are facing the end of the potential end of the New START treaty. We see, overstated, to be sure, announcements out of Moscow about the new capabilities of some of its new missiles. But we also know that Russia has invaded and occupied and illegally annexed, at least in one case, multiple of its neighbors, using what we would consider to be hybrid techniques with conventional forces. But nonetheless, I think it's important that while we very much rightly focus on these newer and asymmetric tools that are enabled by a different information environment, they're enabled by technology, they're enabled by the financial environment, I think it's important that we not forget about, in fact, the very important aspects of the more conventional and strategic aspects of the relationship and the incredible importance of stability, particularly on the nuclear front.
Yeah, and they're developing some conventional arms that are very worrisome.
Yeah, well, absolutely.
Military and the hypersonic stuff and whatnot. All right, well, we are going to turn to our wonderful audience, and I see a young man. We'll take questions one by one quickly because we have a little bit of time, and then we'll use them as inspiration also. So please introduce yourselves as before, and let's start, yeah.
Thank you so much. My name is Daniel Sixto. Again, I'm one of the Model United Nations students. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you all for such a wonderful and thought-provoking panel discussion. So my question draws back to the strategic relationship between Russia and China itself, where there are obviously pitfalls within Central Asia as China increases its Silk Road Economic Belt Initiative, and Russia obviously wants to maintain a presence there, as well as in sub-Saharan Africa, such as recently in the Central African Republic, where Reuters actually released a statement by President Touadera of the Central African Republic saying that he would be open to the opening of a Russian military base in the Central African Republic. So for the West, it's very clear that there's a lot of overlapping interests and pitfalls between these two states. And do you see any prospects for opportunities for the West to kind of move into these regions and increase our presence in order to undermine both Russia and China's ambitions there?
Thank you. Great question.
Well
put.
Several questions, or do we go one?
No, we're going to go one by
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the. Thank you for both of your important questions on the Russia-China aspect. When I was talking in the opening statement, which we were not supposed to have, of all the things that Vladimir Putin is doing that serves his own and his regime's short-term survival interests, but are against the long-term national interests of Russia, things like running mercenary wars and propping up dictators, one very important illustration of that is what he's been doing with China. So one of the things, in my personal opinion, that is most damaging to long-term national interests of Russia that Vladimir Putin has done is to try to turn us away from our natural civilizational family, which is Europe, and to make us kind of a junior partner of the communist dictatorship in Beijing, because that is what he's done. I mean, Boris Nemtsov, the late leader of the Russian opposition, coming up to the 5th anniversary of his assassination next month, he once said that, the Kremlin propaganda keeps calling, us, Russian Democrats and Russian liberals, Western agents, which is, of course, nonsense. There's actually, much stronger grounds for calling Putin and Sechin and others on their side agents of communist China, because everything they're doing is detrimental to us and beneficial to the dictatorship in Beijing. And take, for example, this recently inaugurated pipeline, the strength of Siberia, right? It was shown by many experts on many occasions with many detailed reports that economically this is completely detrimental to Russian interests, but I'm not even talking about economic factors here. Just consider that this pipeline is situated only about 400 or 500 kilometers, I think, from the city of Tomsk, one of the largest cities in Siberia, the only city outside of the European part of the Russian Empire that had a university prior to 1917, one of the old established historic cities in Russia. Only 8% of the population of Tomsk have access to regular natural gas in their homes. And yet, as almost a mockery and an insult, just hundreds of kilometers from the city, Putin and Sechin have inaugurated this mass multi-billion project that's sending off our gas to another country, while residents of one of the largest cities of Russia, most of them don't even have access to that gas themselves. So that's only, and there are many, many examples of this, but kind of the most insulting thing about all this for me is that he is, and I know it's not going to succeed. I'm a historian by education. I try to always look at the big picture as opposed to these short-term trends. So it's not going to succeed in the long term. I mean, we are a European country. We've been part of Europe historically, culturally, mentally for hundreds of years. No Putin and no Sechin are going to change that. But everything they're doing to suit their interests and damage the long-term national interests of our country, I think it's important to point that out and call it for what it is. And on your second question, very important too, on the Central African Republic. The Central African Republic for several years now has been not even a Russian government colony, but kind of a personal fiefdom of Yevgeny Prigozhin. Somebody I've already mentioned, once a convicted criminal who is nicknamed Putin's chef, because he's a catering manager for the Kremlin, literally prepares food, but he's also one of the most influential courtiers of the Putin regime. And he's been running this shadowy mercenary group called the Wagner Group that's been operating to create plausible deniability for the Kremlin, so that the Kremlin can say, you know, with a straight face that we don't have regular Russian troops in all these countries because technically they're quote-unquote private mercenaries. That's the case of Venezuela, that's been the case in Sudan and Libya, of course in eastern Ukraine. That's also been the case in the Central African Republic. Berengo, the former palace of Bokassa, the Central African emperor, that's now the main base of the Wagner Group in the Central African Republic. They own the diamond mines, they own the gold mines. President Tuodera's national security advisor is a Russian intelligence officer by the name of Valery Zakharov. I think it's an unprecedented situation. We have a citizen of one country being a national security advisor to the president of another country, but that is what's happening in the CAR. And in the summer of 2018, 3 Russian investigative journalists went to the CAR to make a documentary, an investigative film about the activities of the Wagner Group. On the second day after their arrival, they were murdered in the Central African Republic. 18 months have passed since then. Neither the Russian nor the CAR authorities have been doing anything to investigate it for reasons that are very clear, I think, to everyone. And so we are trying to do our best to inaugurate some international procedures of investigation with the help, I must say, of the senator from this state, Senator Marco Rubio, who together with Senator Chris Coons, Democrat of Delaware, have been leading the initiative in Congress for an international UN investigation into the murder of the journalists. And we are currently awaiting a response from the UN Secretary General to that request, and I'm hoping it's going to be positive.
Wonderful. We'll take a question from the other side, sir.
Yes, my name is Rod Walton. My question is a request to comment on China's Belt and Road Initiative. Generally, is it beneficial for the rest of the world, or is it negative for the rest of the world? Yesterday afternoon, there was a brief allusion to the fact that it may be negative to developing states that take an infrastructure loan that's too big that they can't pay back. But what about the rest of the world? Is it basically China's attempt to create treaty alliances economically rather than politically, or on the other hand, will it actually help world trade by developing better infrastructure?
All right, thanks. Laura, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I'm going to give you an answer that's not exactly in either of the categories that you just laid out. I'm going to start with what Moises talked about in terms of what being a superpower is and being able to project influence beyond your borders and in far reaches. And certainly BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, is one very significant way that the Chinese party state is seeking to extend its influence outside of its borders. So that in and of itself is not a nefarious thing to do. What I would say is the problematic aspect of how the Chinese party state is extending its BRI program and the commitments it's seeking from other states as part of that. It's the way that it's doing it. So it's using coercive means in order to either enable investments from China and from Chinese companies. It's using market distorting tactics that actually have an effect in shaping and reshaping norms of what in some cases were or have been free markets into markets that are no longer having those characteristics because of the presence and the way that the funds are flowing in and that the markets are being capitalized. They're creating these things called debt traps, which is essentially giving projects and signing contracts with countries that basically have no way of ever making good on the contracts that they're signing. So they then gain coercive leverage and create dependencies, frankly, much like we've seen Russia do in the energy space in parts of Europe, create long-term dependencies where countries, through this economic relationship and this owing of debt, can't actually pay it back. There's an entirely technological aspect to the Belt and Road Initiative, what some call the digital Silk Road. It's the way that they're actually getting their technology into parts of the world, which then have a, again, market distorting effect. If you have more and more parts of the world using certain kinds of Chinese technology, it makes it more prevalent, it spreads more easily. You then have a layering effect of building other kinds of technology on top of it. And the problematic aspect of that, in many ways, is in part the relationship between Chinese technology platforms and the Chinese Communist Party and the government, which then have access to that information and to that data without any kinds of rule of law or transparency. And the last piece was you asked about, is this some sort of new sort of treaty alliance? And I would say, no, it is not. But what it is it's creating footholds on the infrastructure side, and in some cases actually on a physical presence side, where different kinds of projects that are ostensibly economic and ostensibly to help the other country that's on the receiving end, in fact, it gives a very substantial strategic foothold to Chinese assets, which we have learned over time are oftentimes not entirely clear whether they are government, whether they are commercial, whether they are private sector. So my own view, to answer your very initial question, which was good or bad, I would say bad. Because of the way it is being done. And again, that's not in a transparent way, and that's not in a way that actually shows on the surface all these problems, but it all comes along with the package. So I'm sorry, I could go on for a long time on BRI, but it's a great question.
Great. Did anybody else? No. We'll go to the other side of the room. Young man?
Thank you so much. My name is Santiago Arias. I'm here with the Model UN team. And my question is regarding the question of superpowers. Condoleezza Rice once said that superpowers cannot afford to not have a say or an opinion on something, meaning that a superpower must be involved in every corner and every issue if it is to be considered a superpower. Now, I'm not old enough to remember the fall of the Soviet Union. I don't know what the Cold War was like, as I never existed in it. But I am old enough to remember in 2016 when Russia, without firing a single bullet, changed the mentality of the American people, even until now, and will likely do it for years to come. Seeing the third Red Scare is something that has shown me that in order to be a superpower in the current world, you don't need to fire a bullet. Are we working with outdated terms of superpowers, specifically being related strictly to military matters, when we see that in the past 50 years in a country like Afghanistan, the two greatest superpowers have failed to win a war in Afghanistan, and now China is going to be the real winner as it creeps in without firing, again, a single bullet, and only bringing packets of money through the Belt and Road Initiative. So my question is basically, are we working with an outdated definition of what a superpower is, specifically in regions like the Middle East?
No, the definition is what it is, and I think it still works. Superpower is a nation able to project power elsewhere. So that hasn't changed. Your point, however, is very valid when you think about how do you do it? And there we need to add another layer of complexity, which is there are democratic superpowers and there are authoritarian superpowers. And there is a great asymmetry between the two. The authoritarian superpowers have options that the democracies that are also superpowers do not have. Putin can do things that his equivalent, his peer in the White House cannot do, for now at least. And therefore, that dimension is very important in terms of the constraints. I think there is an asymmetric competition for superpowerdom that's going on between democracies that are superpowers and autocracies. And the autocracies have an advantage, which ironically is very much based in technologies produced by democracies. A lot of the technologies that the Russians and the Chinese are using have been developed in the United States, or they are using the platforms that are of companies based in California. And to undermine and attack democracies. So there is that dimension that I think needs to be kept in mind.
Just to add one footnote to Moises. It's unexpected, maybe ironic. Russians are changing their view of being a superpower. At the moment, at least December last year, 47% of Russians thought that Russia could exist only as a military superpower, well, with predatory ambitions. But 49% of Russians think that Russia could be superpower, but economically great and based on the well-being of the people. And as far as I remember, our first day, the Pew Research Center, it seems to me 61% of American respondents viewed the United States only as a military superpower. So you see, kind of, Russians are much more leaning towards much more civilized view of superpower. This is the irony.
We'll take a question from the other side.
Hi, my name is Sebastian. I'm an FIU student. Thank you so much for this conversation. All throughout today, we've heard about these different regions, and we've heard about American influence and intentions and Russian influence and intentions. But what we haven't really discussed at length, and Mr. Naim brought it up briefly, is Russian influence in the United States. And this is a very open-ended question for the whole panel. There has been, of course, a preoccupation here of how much influence the Russian government has at the highest levels of the United States government, and we're talking about the personal entourages of high government officials, including the president, Adam Schiff, the NRA, just to name a few. So what does the panel think about this particular perception? Is it valid? Is it nonsense? Should we worry or not? Discuss whatever you may like about that.
About what? I forgot. I haven't. Should you worry?
Who would like to comment on that? Laura, do you want to comment on this?
Should you worry? Big question. Look, I think that.
Raise the question.
No, but just as Laura's gearing up, I suggest very strongly you look at what Laura's group, the Alliance for the Defense of Democracies, is doing, and look at their website and all that, because it extensively answers your question, actually, and it's some of the best work being done in Washington with an extraordinary team, all geared towards answering your question, basically. Is that fair to say, Laura?
We've done a lot. My team has done a lot of work on this topic. Yes, that's exactly right. Look, I think that we have seen a lot of investigations and evidence come out over the past 3 years since the 2016 election about the ways in which Putin and his proxies have sought to influence American political debate. Most of the analysis that has come out, whether that is the Mueller investigation, whether that is the bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee report, whether that is the intelligence community assessment, whether that has been the subsequent statements from officials in the intelligence community, Department of Justice, FBI, under this administration, have all found concerted and ongoing efforts by the Russian government to try to influence and undermine American democracy. It's also found that the primary goal of those efforts is to create chaos within the United States. It's to pit Americans against each other. It's to polarize us. It's in order to weaken us so that we can, so that we are more handicapped at actually projecting power on the world stage, so that we are less effective at governing, and that we are more focused on ourselves instead of being focused externally. And I see those as very significant concerns from a national security perspective. And by the way, it's very similar to the same tactics that we've seen being used across Europe, across other parts of the world by Putin and his proxies. But that being said, I think it's also, and I think this was implicit in some of your question, it's also really important to understand and not overstate the threat in certain ways. And I think that one of the things that the work that has been done over the past few years has shown is that the vast majority of the tactics that we have seen being used by the Russian government in order to try to undermine and interfere in American democracy is actually exploiting vulnerabilities within our own system. And so my belief is that our hyper-partisanship is a vulnerability. Our systemic racism is a vulnerability. Our instincts to manipulate the information environment for our own domestic political purposes is a vulnerability. Our lack of transparency in our financial system is a vulnerability. And the gridlock that we see in huge parts of our government is a vulnerability. And so some of the most important things that we can do in order to better build resilience against that kind of external influence, that kind of nefarious external influence, is actually to look within ourselves and strengthen ourselves here at home. And so I think that's, to me, the biggest takeaway from some of these, the work that's been done.
Boy, is that a beautiful way to conclude this panel. we are to the second.
You're in time.
Thank you very much, and thank you, FIU, for hosting this. And I see that